Well, good morning to you. It is good to be with you on this Tuesday, July 14th. I think we're up and going now, so it is good to be with you today. Yesterday we were talking about, or I mentioned anyway, Ephesians 4, and so when I turned to the lectionary readings for today and Ephesians 4 was there, I thought, well, that was a pretty good warm-up without necessarily knowing ahead of time that that's where we would head up. Yesterday we talked about that in our disciple class that we had on Sunday night, we had read the entire chapter of Ephesians 4 together, and I challenged everyone to summarize the entire chapter with just 2 words. And I shared a couple of those with you. One was grow up, that we could read Ephesians 4, and really it's God saying to us, come on, grow up. And another one was willing transformation, that we come before God with willing hearts, asking Him to transform and redeem us. Well, I want to share just a little bit of Ephesians 4 with you this morning and just share briefly about it. So Ephesians chapter 4, starting in verse 17. So I tell you this and insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do, in the futility of their thinking. They are darkened in their understanding and separated from the life of God, because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. Having lost all sensitivity, they have given themselves over to sensuality, so as to indulge every kind of impurity, and they are full of greed. That, however, is not the way of life you have learned when you heard about Christ and were taught in Him in accordance with the truth that is Jesus. You were taught, with regard to your former way of life, to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your minds, and to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. Scripture says that we are not to be like the Gentiles and to not live as the Gentiles who were futile in their thinking. At the time that this was written to the church in Ephesus, Gentiles were coming to know Christ. In fact, Paul's converts, many of those who said yes to Jesus came out of a Gentile experience. Some were Jews, but many of them were Gentiles. And at the time, there were many gods that Gentiles would have worshipped in their lives. In fact, they would have a whole pantheon of gods. If you remember hearing things about the Egyptians, how they had a god for the river and a god for the rain and a god for the land and a god for the harvest and all sorts of different gods, that wasn't too far off from how the Greeks and the Romans engaged in life either. They had also a whole pantheon of gods. And so one of the challenges became when people said yes to Jesus that they didn't just add on another God. They didn't just make room for another God to worship alongside all of the other ones, but that they took away completely all of the other gods. And they committed to focusing and worshiping on just one God, the one true God. And the challenge with just adding on a God, the challenge with not putting God as our first priority, is that nothing really changes in our attitudes, in our approaches, in our minds, in our hearts. That our schedules, our priorities, our willingness to sacrifice isn't really adjusted. We just make room for one more God. In the time of Gentiles, when this was being written to the church in Ephesus, a lot of Gentile worship of gods was to attempt to please the gods. And so sacrifices were made and formulaic prayers were said so as to keep in good step with the gods. So if the gods were happy with you, they would bless you. If they were angry with you or upset with you, you would be punished. And so much of activity was simply trying to please the gods and going about the rhythms of daily life of how it is that today I can go through some motions to please those gods and to keep on their good side. But what didn't happen with that worship was an inward change. It was an outward change. There were activities. There were things that people saw you do in order to worship the gods. You would go and light a candle or say a prayer or bring a sacrifice. So there were outward activities, but the inward change was not something that was experienced. And so somebody's heart, their soul, their mind was not impacted by worshiping 1 or 3 or 5 or 17 gods. There really was not that that impact. And so when Paul writes to the church in Ephesus and says, don't be like the Gentiles who are futile in their thinking, there's some aspect of don't, one, just add Jesus on to the rest of the other priorities in your life, but be completely transformed by him. Have your mind, your heart, your spirit completely transformed. Allow God to turn your life upside down for the sake of him, rather than just simply acquiescing to, yep, I'll follow Jesus. Allow your true inner selves to be transformed by his truth and his hope and his forgiveness, not just your outward activity that others see. And Paul talks about the hardening of hearts. And if that sounds familiar, perhaps you were thinking of in Exodus, we read that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. That word hardening of hearts, it's like if you are somebody who goes barefoot a lot in the summer and you build up calluses on the bottom of your feet. That's that idea of a hardening, is that it's a callus. You lose perception. When your bottom of your feet are calloused, it's easier for you than it is for me, who hates going barefoot, to walk across maybe a path that has some rocks and sticks on it, because you've lost a little bit of perception. The idea of a hardening of heart means that your heart becomes covered with a callus. You become blind. You lose perception. And as a result, you don't listen to God. And Paul says, don't let that happen. Don't let that happen. And he warns them about not giving themselves over to sensuality. Now, oftentimes that is interpreted and taught as sexual immorality, and indeed that is present. But let's think more broadly about sensuality and think about what it means to just fully give into our senses. Like I want what I see. I want to like what I see. I want to like what I hear. My senses matter more than other things. And so we can see how this can easily devolve into arguments that we know exist in churches and ministries today. The church that splits over whether the carpet should be red or blue. Those are individuals who are caught up in their senses, raising those to a higher level of caught up in the sensuality of what I like is what really matters. Paul then talks about putting off your old self, the old self that is corrupted by deceitful desires. Not just desires, but deceitful desires. So not just those things that we long for that have more importance to us than Jesus, but those desires who lie also to us and tell us and convince us that not only are they good to pursue and have and important in our lives, but they lie to us that it's okay that they're more important than Jesus because somehow it all is all right. Deceitful desires are what we are to avoid. That deceit tells us that those desires are important, even more important than God and his mission. Finally, in the scripture portion that we talked about, it says to put on your new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. True righteousness and holiness. God calls us to be single-minded in our devotion, in our affection, in our focus on him and him alone. Not our senses, not our desires, not our deceitful desires, not a calloused heart that is numbed to his call and more interested in the world, but a true singular-minded focus on pursuing God and his mission, the mission of loving God and loving people. the mission of sharing the good news with others, the mission of being about bringing God's kingdom here on earth as it is in heaven. That is evidence of us having put on our new selves. Our desires, they fall to the wayside. Our senses of what we prefer are not as important. Our hearts, as it says in Jeremiah, become new and fresh and soft again, so that we can perceive God's voice. We can listen to him and respond in obedience. May that indeed be said of us. And may God continue to do a work in us to soften our hardened hearts, to transform our desires, and to fix our minds, our hearts, our souls on the one and only true thing that truly matters. Not that we just simply add on Jesus to our busy, full life, but that he becomes our one and only sole focus, and that everything else falls away. That is my prayer for all of us this morning. I pray that you have a great day, and we'll see you tomorrow.